seen it, something I'll give you a shout.
Perfect. I'll give your introduction, and then you're good. Then you're good to start. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Politics and Prose. Thanks for being here today. I'll be nice and short and sweet so that we can start the event. So before I get started, please make sure to take out your cell phones and silence them so we don't disturb the event. When we get time to open the floor for questions, we placed a standing microphone at the end of the aisle to your right, so it's behind this white pillar. And so if you haven't, so when it's time, just please line up and speak clearly into the microphone so that we can all hear your question. We'll also be live streaming the event today, so you and your friends and family can go back and watch it after the event. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing line up here at this table, so you haven't already purchased the book, we have copies behind the register for purchase at the front of the store. And for the signing line, we'll ask you to again line up starting at the pillar. And we will come by and ask for your name if you would like it personalized. So just please have your books open and ready to go. And once the event is complete, please leave the chairs where they are because we do have another event coming up afterwards. So now I'm very excited to introduce Lawrence Ingrassia celebrating the release of A Fatal Inheritance, How a Family Misfortune Revealed a Deadly Medical Mystery. Lawrence Ingrassia is a former business economics editor and deputy managing editor at the New York Times. Having previously spent 25 years at the Wall Street Journal, he also served as a managing editor of the Los Angeles Times. The coverage he directed has won 5 Pulitzer Prizes. His first book, $1 Billion Brand Club, chronicles the rise of popular direct-to-customer e-commerce brands, and his latest book, A Fatal Inheritance, narrates the tale of a team of dedicated researchers who solve the medical mystery behind seemingly unrelated cancers devastating his and other families. Ingrassia will be joining a conversation with Dan Balz. Balz is chief correspondent at the Washington Post. He joined the Post in 1978 and has been involved in political coverage as a reporter or editor throughout his career. He's a regular panelist on PBS's Washington Week and has appeared on other public affairs programs. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Lawrence Ingrassia and Dan Balz.
Thank you, Lily, for the introductions, and thank you all for being here. This is a real treat for me. Larry and I have a long and deep connection, as there are others in the room that go back way with us. We have a connection through the University of Illinois, where I went to school, and Larry went to school, and his brother Paul went to school, and several others in the audience here went to school, and I was the oldest of this group, and so I predated Larry at the University of Illinois, slightly overlapped with Paul. Got to know Paul first, and then I guess, Larry, you and I got to know one another when you were London bureau chief. That's when we really...
Yeah, at the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah. Larry was there for 5 years. I was there for 3.5 months. But that's when
a cup of coffee, but it was really a cup of tea.
It was a cup of tea, right? But it was also in the moment when Princess Diana died. So it was quite a moment that we were overlapping. But we went through some of what's in this book, particularly with Paul and his son. But there was so much that I learned about the family, and then obviously the science. So maybe the best way to begin is just talk a little bit about your family, the Ingrassia family, and kind of what this book tells us.
Yeah, so this is, in many ways, it's 2 books in one. It's a memoir, but also it's a medical mystery. And I never really intended to write this. In fact, if I thought that anybody should write this book, it would be my brother, Paul, because of course all the cancers were, most of the cancers were in his family and not mine, and we'll talk about that later. But when he died in 2019, he was the last member of my immediate family, and I was the only one left. My mother had died in 1968 when she was 42 of breast cancer. She had had cancer off and on for a number of years. Can't remember exactly when because all the medical records are lost, and it was such a long time ago. None of my relatives were alive. Our youngest sister died at age 24, abdominal cancer. Within a year, that was in the early 80s, within a year, Paul's son, one of his 3 sons, Charlie, got cancer in his cheek. Fortunately, he survived, even though he was given a 20% chance of survival when he first got the diagnosis. Then our other sister died when she was 32 in 1987, and Paul got cancer in 1997, lung cancer. So cancer has been a presence in our family for such a long time. I didn't think to write about it until after he died. And initially, I just wanted to find more about this mutation that I knew was in the family. Hadn't known very long in the family because despite all these cancers, we actually didn't learn about the mutation in a gene called P53, which turns out to be a very important gene, until around 2015. Paul got tested and he was tested positive, not surprisingly. I got tested and was tested negative. It's a 50-50 chance. I had won the genetic lottery. I was the lucky one. When I started just poking around, kind of doing some internet search, several things kind of caught my attention. One, that this was a very bad mutation to have. I kind of knew that, but when you kind of look at it and see the numbers, it's really bad. Cancer, unlike a lot of cancer mutations, it can result in cancers happening all over the body. And it also said that Dr. Joe Fraumeni, one of the two doctors this was named after, Li-Fraumeni syndrome, was still alive. And I thought that's interesting, kind of why don't I give him a call?
Can I ask you a question about that specifically? Because I remember we had dinner at Roger Simon and Marcia Kramer's in March of 2020. This was a few months after Paul had died, and Bob was there. Bob Hillman was there also. And one of the reasons you were in town was that you were beginning to try to reach some people. Was Fraumeni
exactly.
one of them?
Yes, exactly. So I had I reached out, and thanks to the NCI, they put me in touch with Joe Fraumeni. Had a nice telephone conversation. I'm intrigued enough because what he told me then was, we'd come across this unusual family with a lot of cancers. Not my family, a different family. And we raised the question, wrote a paper, raised the question of whether there might be something hereditary. And we were immediately kind of met with a lot of skepticism. Oh, how could that be? All these cancers are different. And then the other thing he told me was, hey, if you go back to the 1960s, cancer was a bit of a black box. We didn't know a lot about it. So when he was telling me these things, again, being a reporter, I'm like, well, that's curious. That's all this sounds kind of interesting. And I had to be on the East Coast in March of 2020, just before COVID lockdown began by chance. And had, kind of asked the NCI, can I meet with Joe Fraumeni? And that was this. I had 2 meetings with him, which turned out to be kind of very helpful, where he fleshed out much more about this story and made me think, yeah, there's something here. I'm not sure if there's a book here, but there's something interesting enough.
Let me ask you this, and then I want to jump to the medical mystery part of the book. And that is, did you have trepidation about starting down this path and doing this, and in a sense, therefore having to relive a lot of painful history of your own family?
Good question. Probably I would have more trepidation if I'd known everything that I knew now, right? Kind of at the time, I guess I thought I knew everything about my family. I knew most things about my family, but there are details that I didn't know. Okay, so, and I think I was just more curious about it. I mean, I don't know kind of anybody else has written a memoir, especially a memoir that kind of is not just a memoir, but it kind of crosses over. In doing it, I had 2 hats on. I had this hat on, kind of I was writing about my family, but a lot of it was I'm a writer, and how am I going to make this interesting, and how am I going to get the information? And by the way, I don't know anything about genetics, and how am I going to understand it so I can write about it? So more than the trepidation, it was like, kind of you're at the base of the mountain, and you're kind of looking up to the mountaintop. It's like, how am I going to get there? Yeah. But some of that, kind of those moments would occur later in the reporting.
Yeah. Well, tell us more about Frederick Li and Joseph Fraumeni, because they are so essential to this whole enterprise.
Many of you here are writers. For any story to be effective, to really engage people, you have to build it around the people that you're writing about. course, I knew my family, and I knew I could family enough that I could build around that. I didn't know the scientists, but scientists actually are inherently interesting because they're explorers. They're kind of trying to find out things, much as we are as reporters. And again, kind of looking into the backgrounds of just talking to Joe Fraumeni, son of Italian immigrants, Fred Li, son of Chinese immigrants, kind of came here when he was 7 years old. His father had been a general in the Nationalist Army, kind of refugees from China. And, kind of they meet together and just kind of click and embark on this journey to kind of solve something. And that's the medical mystery. And it was very interesting because, Dr. Li heard of this family. It was an unusual family. He was in Washington. He had only been in Washington a few months. And there was a father who was 23 years old who had leukemia. And at the same time, within months, he had a son who had a soft tissue cancer in his arm, 10 months old. The odds against that are astronomical. And that's what, kind of, again, I think there's overlap between writers and scientists. They're like, oh, that's unusual. What is going on there? How am I going to, what do I need to find out? Little did they know it would take more than 20 years to find out. We usually kind of get to ours a little bit faster.
But what was the prevailing view of how people got cancer or how cancer was transmitted?
And this is where they ran into a lot of skepticism early on. So they write this paper because they researched this family. It took them quite a bit of time. They fortunately kind of found some family members who were able to help them. There were dozens of cancers in this family over many generations, many different kinds of cancers. When they wrote the paper, the response that they got was, well, just a second. And they acknowledge this in the paper. They didn't ever state more than they knew. There are 100 million families in the United States, so you found a family that has a lot of cancers. I mean, that's just sheer chance would tell you that is going to happen. Or, kind of maybe it's something environmental. Not a lot was known about environmental cancers then, but maybe there is some carcinogen. But really what we think most cancers are caused by are viruses. That was the prevailing theory at the time. A lot of research money was going into proving that viruses, and there had been some evidence with animals having cancers, viral caused cancers. And that's why there was so much focus. And that's why they kind of when they said, maybe it's hereditary, in fact, they ended up their first paper published in 1969 had a question mark, kind of a familial syndrome. And the reaction was, kind of, we don't think so. Yeah. Again, one of the things I found is that in science, probably as in most fields, that the experts feel if something new was going to be discovered, it wasn't going to be discovered by somebody new. We would have discovered it. How could you guys think that you were the ones that got this?
Well, I was struck by one of the quotes in the book. It was a 1966 Nobel lecture by
Peyton Rouse.
Peyton Rouse, who had won the Nobel 55 years after the research that he had done. I think you're right that it's the longest
on viruses.
On viruses. And in there, he talks about the issue of hereditary transmission. And he said, numerous facts, when taken together, decisively exclude this supposition. But in the face of that, how did Li and Fraumeni continue to kind of plow forward? Because they weren't able to prove anything.
They weren't able to prove anything. And I think this is to their credit as curious, dedicated scientists. So why were they undeterred? So I think that there were several reasons. One, if you take chance, they could understand that it could be chance. Okay, that one, you could never rule that one out. Virus. Why were they skeptical about, kind of that this would be caused by virus? Well, it turns out that this family that they followed was a sprawling family. They weren't all living together in the same city or even region. Kind of some of them were in California, some of them were in the Midwest, some of them were in the Pacific Northwest, some were in Arizona, Nevada. So they thought, well, just a second, kind of if it's viruses, kind of that's odd that it would spread, kind of all those areas to all those people. Okay. And the same thing for the environmental risk. I thought, well, kind of, again, if they all live by a, copper smelter that was spewing out all sorts of potential carcinogens, yeah, maybe. But these people lived in all sorts of different places. So again, they didn't want to get ahead of their skis, but I think they were said, let's keep following these families. Let's see what happens over the next few years. And so in 1975, interestingly, right after they published that paper in 1969, another infant in that family got cancer, 3 years old, died within 6 months. So again, kind of they're thinking, kind of this doesn't seem like coincidence to us if this keeps happening. But kind of 5 years later, they did another kind of very brief study, and sure enough, in the intervening 5 years, there was a much higher rate of cancer in the family than would have been expected in a normal American family.
But really, at that point, all they had was kind of numbers, right? I mean, they didn't know anything about what it was that may have been hereditary.
Right. Right.
You mentioned 75. There was a conference you write about in 1975
right.
in Orlando, in which it's kind of, okay, the study of genetics and cancer is now real. What was it that brought people to that consensus after all the resistance that had been there for so many years?
One of the things that I found fascinating in writing the book, and the way I decided to structure the book, if you look at it is alternating chapters. It's my family, the scientist, family A, this family that they had come across, which had these high level of cancers, and the evolution of the understanding of cancer research, focusing on some of the other pioneering geneticists. Okay, so Dr. Fraumeni was very helpful in saying, yeah, kind of, we identified this thing that became this syndrome and eventually found a mutation. But you know what, Larry, we weren't the only ones who were involved in this research. There were a number of other doctors who were poking around, either coming across families or just kind of curious about occurrences of cancer at higher rates in certain populations. And so that was part of the kind of fun and also challenge that I had, which I need to understand more about that. And so I did, I wrote about Dr. Alfred Knudsen, who studied eye cancer in babies and children, and how he developed a theory that, given the propensity of this, particularly in children one of whose parents had eye cancer, a mathematical model indicated that there must be some hereditary factor. Couldn't prove it because the technology wasn't available at that time to show it. But he writes a paper. Again, it's like, oh, that sounds interesting. We don't really know, but kind of maybe. It's all part of this ferment that is going on in the 70s, and that's what's happening in the early 70s. There's another doctor, Henry Lynch, who is based in Nebraska and in Omaha, and he's coming across these families which have high rate of colon cancer, and he's saying, oh my gosh, kind of this really kind of seems unusual, and he's documenting it and coming across it, and again, he's starting to write it up, and the experts kind of who are still focusing on viruses are saying, this guy from Nebraska, what does he know about genetics? And how can he, kind of, and he's being dismissed too. But all these people are kind of, it's a little bit of knowledge added each time. And that's where these conferences, then kind of Fraumeni and Li and some of their colleagues at the National Cancer Institute say, hey, you know what, it seems like there's enough going on here that we maybe should all get together and talk about it.
And to what extent did that then accelerate the research, bring more people in to do it? I mean, there was one point where you talk about how before a certain point there were like 100 journal articles, and after a certain point there were, I forget the number, 1,000 or something on this particular.
But we're still not even at P53, kind of. This is, yeah. So this is.
Before, you mentioned P53. Explain what P53 is and how it became so important in this study.
They didn't know what was causing. back in the 70s, they didn't actually have an ability to kind of examine genes in great detail. Okay, this is part of the medical mystery and why it took so long, 20 years before they solved it, because you had to have the technology to do what's called gene sequencing, where you could look inside a gene and you could see a mutation in a gene. And eventually the way it was solved, we're kind of jumping to 1990s, they didn't know this at the time. Eventually the way it was solved was that they had, Li and Fraumeni had the presence of mind to collect tissues, skin and blood samples from family A and other families that they were studying with high. When they finally had the technology so that they could look inside individual genes, they could see in the people who have cancer in the family, they have a mutation. In the same gene, all the other people in the family who don't have cancer don't have the mutation. Bingo. That was kind of the final aha moment that was finally to prove this. And it turns out P53 is what's called a cancer suppressor gene. We all have cells that can turn cancers. Our cells are constantly dividing. Often those divisions are benign, but occasionally they're potentially malignant. And the great thing about P53 is that it's kind of a search and destroy gene. It identifies genes that potentially could become cancers, and it either kind of kills them or repairs them. It's not the only cancer suppressor gene, it turns out, but it is the most important cancer suppressor gene.
When before we got to 1990, the Li-Fraumeni syndrome was identified. How did that come about, and how did that affect future research?
So again, throughout the 70s and into the 80s, a greater understanding that you have this, kind of revolution really in the understanding of genetics. And they're identifying all sorts of new genes. The human genome is starting to become into focus. Kind of by the early 1980s, again, 1982, Li and Fraumeni published yet another paper. They've expanded the number of families. They're looking at more families. Again, and finding out the families continue to have a high rate of cancer. Much higher rate than you would expect in the population overall. And at that time, kind of somebody says, oh, kind of the British scientists who are studying similar families, they say, oh, we have found some families with Li-Fraumeni syndrome. Nobody had kind of come up with that before, but because everybody knew their first paper by now, that's where somebody coined it. They didn't coin it at all.
Larry, when Li and Fraumeni began, there was no internet, there was no email. I mean, the technology that we all take for granted didn't exist. How did they go about finding people, particularly in the Kilius family, which is the first family
the extended family?
Yeah. How did they find them? Because they had to go back and try to assemble a family history.
Family tree, because how do you know that there are a lot of cancers in the family? You can't just take the word of the family members, right? Okay, I remember back in, kind of 50 years ago, I think that my grandmother or my aunt had this cancer or whatever. So after, when the father and baby son, Ned and Daryl Kilius, had cancer, Li had the good fortune, he was visiting them one time when Ned's mother, who lived in California, came to Baltimore to be with them. And he said, hey, if this family is interesting, if there's some way that we can kind of figure out what's going on. And she was desperate to do anything that she might be able to do to help her son and grandson. The day she got back to LA, she put together a letter that was written to Li, and it had a rudimentary family tree, not like an entire family tree, but kind of rudimentary family tree with a little bit of, I think that this person may have had cancer, I think that this person may have had cancer, this person we don't know, kind of whatever. But that gave him the beginnings of, okay, now I can, and also where they lived. Okay, so then so he gets this, and he becomes a detective. he starts writing letters around the country to hospitals where maybe these families lived, to where they were treated. He starts to state agencies. He's looking for death certificates. We'll have cause of death. He's looking for medical records. And it actually takes a couple of years before they do this. But Ermacilius turns out to be like a critical figure in the research, because without one family member who is like really determined to help figure out what's going on and to be their, kind of, as it were, unofficial research assistant. I mean, obviously she's not gathering the data, but she's actually pointing them in the direction. She's constantly in contact with him. What are you doing? How's it going? Kind of what are you finding? And, he's saying at times, it's slow. I mean, one of the things that when you think about cancer research and why it's so difficult, cancers don't kind of occur like regularly. You can't say, okay, we're going to have, kind of every few months, we're going to check and see who has cancer. A cancer, even in a highly cancer-prone family, you might have a cancer in this year and not for 5 years or 10 years. I mean, look at my family, kind of my mother in 1968 and not another till 1980. And then, kind of Charlie in 82 and my sister in 87. But, they're random, they're sporadic. So this is another one of the reasons why, kind of it takes so long, kind of you just have to be patient. And I had great respect for the patients as they were, kind of painstakingly kind of gathering this, kind of every few years, putting this information together, slowly, carefully building a case that, hey, there is something more here, kind of than.
The description of what they were doing at the very early stage, lay people like me who are not scientists, we think of scientists in the lab, right?
Yeah.
And yet, as you say, this was detective work. This wasn't, looking at slides and looking at a microscope, right, or however they do it. But give us a sense of kind of what were the steps that started in that way and then went into the lab? And as you say, then the technology kept advancing, which allowed for more and more.
There was occasional lab work. At one point, in the late 60s, around the time they wrote the paper, they actually sent a team of doctors out to Southern California, where a large branch of this family was located. And they took tissue samples, which they would benefit from many years later. But even then, they actually tested those tissue samples to see if they had any viruses in it. Couldn't find anything.
Because they thought at that point they were still exploring the.
Well, I think they were told by their seniors that, kind of, we think it might be viruses. We want you to kind of go and test for viruses. Okay, kind of, it's like reporter being told by his editor, kind of go check this out. And that you don't really, it's probably not really there. And you go check it out anyway. And then you go back and say, no, it's not really a story.
Yeah, we can identify with
that. But they went and that doesn't mean, of course, that doesn't mean there's not a virus. Could be an unidentified virus. Okay, so it's, again, not disproving, but it's certainly not, kind of proving it. What happened in the intervening years, so we kind of get up to 1980, what happened in the intervening years is that the technology improves, as we talked about, where you can look inside genes and try to figure out what's going on. The data starts to seem, kind of irrefutable that something is going on, right? The rates are too high. Maybe we can't 100% rule out viruses, but we're kind of 99% rule out viruses because these families. Ditto kind of environmental, because these families are from all over the place. And so the understanding of genetics and cancer genetics has increased by the late 80s, that they kind of begin this search for, they now have the tools. Other scientists are learning more about genes. P53, they know P53 exists, but they don't know what the role of P53 is initially, as a matter of fact. In fact, they thought P53 was a cancer-causing gene, was an oncogene. And the reason they thought it was a cancer-causing gene, it was that P53 showed up in a lot of tumors. It's actually in more than half of all tumors you'll find a P53 mutation. So they thought that was what it was. It was a cancer-causing gene. So they actually had some reason, of the many genes, to start suspecting that maybe something has to do with P53. Yeah. But it's this slow incremental growth in both the knowledge and then the technology that leads us to their ability to finally try to solve the mystery.
Well, one of the interesting kind of aspects of your description of the science is the competition that goes on, and the idea that if somebody's going to discover it, I want to discover it. I don't want somebody else to discover it. And yet, people don't know exactly who's doing what and how far along they are. And there's a couple of chapters in the book in which you talk about this having to do specifically with the mutation of the P53.
I don't know kind of exactly, so I'm kind of looking out. Is Esther Chang in the audience today? She said she might or might not be able to come. She's not here. When I was, one of the things I did when I kind of wanted to get like, how can I tell every little detail about the final year that led to the search of the identification of this gene, solving the medical mystery. So I got a copy of the academic paper was written that was published in late November 1990 with this huge finding of the P53 mutation. And I called everybody whose name was on that paper. And there were about 8 scientists whose name was on that paper, whoever I could reach with who was still alive. And in talking to one person, they said, yeah, and they kind of told me all the details, and it was really fascinating. And one of them said, and oh yes, there was another group that that came up with a similar finding around the same time and published about a month later. And we think that they found out about it when one of us went to a conference after we had discovered the mutation, but before we actually had published it. Usually scientists are very careful, a little bit like journalists, and talking out loud about their findings before publication. But one of the head of the team that had found the gene at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston went to a conference and talked about it, kind of, even though it hadn't been published yet. It was going to be published in about a month or so. He went and talked about it. So as chance would have it, and they thought that another team heard that, rushed to duplicate it, and try to beat them into print. And 2 or 3 people told me that. And so I thought, okay, I'll call up the people who wrote the other paper. And I called up the people who wrote the other paper and said, well, that's not exactly how, but we actually kind of had been working on it for a year and a half ourselves. But we came up, at almost exactly the same time, we had the same finding. Not with this family, with another family that was cancer prone. And we made the finding. We wanted to get our paper published in Science. Everybody wants to get their paper published in Science, it turns out. I didn't realize that. Kind of Science, Nature, there's a handful of, kind of top publications, a little bit like, kind of the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, kind of that kind of small world. And they called up the Science, the second team, which was down in Washington, here in DC, and said, hey, we've got this really kind of great finding. And they were told, well, actually, we've got another paper that's been submitted already. It's like, yikes. They were hoping that it would be published at the same time in the same publication, but Team A said, we got our paper in first. We want it to be published first. Now, in the end, kind of one team got most of the glory, another team didn't get as much glory. They published within a few weeks in Nature. It was the validation. It was kind of further proof. But of course, the first paper that was reported ended up not just being in Science, but it was on the front page of the New York Times. Kind of the Wall Street Journal had a big story. I presume the Washington Post. I mean, it was like huge news. It was the first major finding of a gene connected with cancers like this, a mutation. My view of that is that kind of as in newspaper world, it's a little bit rough and tumble, but competition spurs people to do their best work.
Well, and you've got at least one other example of which there was kind of similar competition, and the person who came in second had nothing but praise and good words for the people who had gotten there a little bit ahead of them.
Right, right.
So there is that. So the mutated gene is identified. How does that change things? It's not a cure for cancer.
Right.
What does it mean for families who have this, or how do people find out about it?
So there's a lot of hope, I think, right at the time of the research that it might lead to, if we can just figure a way to fix P53, we're going to kind of have new drugs that are really going to help treat cancer. It's a lot harder than that. The main thing that we kind of have done is that if you know that you have the mutation, you can be screened. And you can, because and by screening you can catch cancers early and you can reduce the chance that you're going to have. You can increase the survival rate. The best way to treat cancer is to find it early. But no, there is no cure. There's no cure for any. It turns out that there are about 50 different cancer, or even more, kind of genetic mutations that lead to cancer. No cures for any of them. Someday maybe CRISPR kind of gene editing, but we're a ways off. Yeah. But there has been a lot of progress thanks to kind of new treatments and to kind of screening.
Yeah. Laurie McGinley, who did the review of the book for the Post, said that the medical mystery part of the book is fascinating, but I think she called it the beating heart of the book are the people and the families, your family being one. You quote someone who had a family, similar problems, who spoke at a conference, I forget the year. His name was Weiss.
Oliver Weiss.
Right.
Yeah, Oliver Weiss.
Weiss. And his message to the scientists was, you've done all this great work, but all we have as a result of it is screening, and basically said it's not acceptable to families. It shouldn't be acceptable to you. That must have a powerful effect on the people who are working as hard as they can, and yet recognize that there are limits to the applicability of what they've provided.
Yeah, I know there are a lot of scientists who've joined us, and they're working incredibly hard in what they've achieved, and they aren't satisfied. I think probably as much as any of us. They know kind of, and a lot of them have cancers in their families too. Kind of, so they understand what the challenges are. But kind of it is a big motivating factors, I think.
Yeah. How did all of this then affect your family?
We didn't know about it until, as we talked until 2015. What I found was interesting about it, kind of getting back to our initial conversation about, kind of the trepidation, is just all this research enabled me to connect even more with my family. Remember, my sisters had died more than almost 40 and 40 years ago, around 40 years ago, give or minus. I'd lost touch with all their friends for the most part. And so this gave me, kind of, that was I think, learning about them and what their hopes and fears were. So at one point, one of my sisters was married. She didn't have children, but I got a copy of her husband gave me a copy of a diary that she kept from the beginning, from when she learned she had cancer till she no longer keep the diary. And it was painful to read. It was hard. In part because it was a time in the 80s where there was a lot of mind over matter, and if you just kind of use your willpower, kind of you can help cure yourself. If you don't have enough willpower, then that's bad for you. So it doesn't say that you're to blame, but I think for some people, they kind of put the blame on themselves. And kind of, I have to say, I kind of shed some tears in that, because it's like, Gina, kind of that didn't have anything to do with that. You had a genetic mutation. You didn't realize that. And again, we didn't think that there was a genetic mutation. Our father was a research chemist. We thought maybe it was environmental.
Right.
And the other reason that we didn't suspect, not only kind of were the cancers different, but our mother was the first one in our family who had cancer. Neither of her parents, who both lived in their 80s, or her sister, who lived in her 80s, had cancer. So we didn't have this pattern. And Dr. Fraumeni explained to me, well, about 5 to 10% of all cases of Li-Fraumeni syndrome, the P53 mutation is not inherited, but it is, you are born with it at the moment of conception. So there's all these things kind of where you look back, and now it is all understandable. Kind of back then, kind of it was like a puzzlement. Kind of, I just think you focus on fighting the battles and winning the battles as opposed to worrying too much about what the causes were.
Yeah. The science that you describe in here is very complicated. I mean, you were you didn't know, and you knew very little about it. How daunting was that? How difficult was it to master it? Who helped you on that, if anybody? Tell us just about how
yeah,
you.
so part of that is that, kind of as a journalist, I think that our jobs are to try to write about complicated things in ways that other people can understand them without kind of make them a little bit less complicated. Um, what I say is kind of simplify without oversimplifying. So, I had the benefit. I would read a paper and I'd say, did I really understand that paper? And sometimes I would go to the author of the paper. Sometimes I would go to Li-Fraumeni, sometimes, I would go to my cousin, Frank Lagerfo, who's he's not a geneticist, but he's a cardiovascular surgeon, retired at Harvard. And I would say, yeah, can you read this? Do I kind of understand it right? And he said, yeah, pretty much. And so there was a lot of, I did bounce off, kind of the science stuff. I kind of read a lot about it and I bounced it off. And I just wanted to make sure. And when I did it, I said, look, remember, I'm kind of writing this for a general audience. I'm not writing it for, kind of medical students, so please help me, when you give me, tell me if it's wrong, tell me. If it's fine, tell me. If it needs a little bit more nuance, tell me, but it has to be in a way that is not too technical. And kind of it was, I would say there were probably a half dozen readers with medical backgrounds, including one of the doctors who had treated my sister Angela in 1980, kind of who I tracked down.
He's the one who said, I have never forgotten your sister, something?
Yeah. So again, my sister Angela, 24, died. She got cancer when she was 23 and died when she was 24. And my sister-in-law remembered his last name. I couldn't remember. It was Locker. This guy was in Boston. I knew he'd been treated in Boston, but I didn't know how to find him. Kind of went online. The internet now is actually very helpful for a lot of things. And I found a Dr. Gershon Locker, who'd been an oncologist, who was retired, kind of recently retired, because you kind of go onto LinkedIn and you can kind of get everybody's, kind of resume. That's really nice. And so I thought, kind of maybe it's him. I'm not 100% sure, but, kind of, so I wrote him a message. I said, hey, look, I don't know. I think that you may have treated my sister, kind of 40 years ago. It's a long time ago. You may not remember, kind of sorry if you don't. Sorry if you're the wrong person, kind of send it off. And I'd have to look back. It was either within hours or the next day. I had kept. It was on LinkedIn. I'd reached out, but I had left my email address, and I was sitting at my desk, and I remember kind of a message popped up, and it said, it was a time that I really kind of just had to pause. Subject line was, "I have never forgotten your sister." And he went on to say that when Angela died, this is a 24-year-old woman. Before she died, she had kind of prearranged to send out flowering plants to all of us and to a number of other people, obviously including him. He said, how she found my home address, I don't know. She sent the flowering plants out with a one-word message: forward. And kind of think that. I mean, even now I kind of tear up when I think that she would have a presence, kind of the character, kind of robbed of her entire life, right? Kind of all the experiences that all of us, kind of looking around this room, kind of have taken for granted and have. And yet, kind of facing an end of that, an end of all her hopes that she sent that. Anyway, so, I chatted with him and he said, yeah, I just, kind of, he said, that moment lived with me forever. Kind of, he's had thousands of patients since then. But so I created, obviously that created a bond. So I sent him a copy of the book before it was published. I said, can you just look at this? He's actually an oncologist and kind of knows a bit about genetics. I think it's early in his career, actually, he had spent some time at the NCI. So that was another good person to bounce it on.
We're going to turn to questions from all of you if you have some in 1 minute. There's a microphone right up here, or just at the pillar here, to your left. There. 1 minute. Larry, since the book has been published, What have you heard from people?
Probably the most moving things. I've got a lot of messages from people who have cancer in their family. And, in some cases they have Li-Fraumeni syndrome. And they say, thank you for writing this. Your family is my family. Now, this is an incredibly rare syndrome. It's like 5 to 10,000 families estimated, maybe more because, not everybody in the United States has been tested, but it's an incredibly rare condition. Many families, if they see their doctor and they say they've got Li-Fraumeni syndrome, the reaction is, Li what? Kind of Li-Frau what? They don't know what it is. And so I think for them to have somebody write a book, and there are, look, I didn't discover Li-Fraumeni syndrome. I'm just writing about it. Kind of looking at the audience. Holly Fraumeni, who's a niece of Joe Fraumeni, kind of has very active in a group that was started a decade or so ago, 15 years ago, Li-Fraumeni Syndrome Association, which is a great source of information about Li-Fraumeni syndrome. But I think that for people to see a book written about this very rare thing they have, I think it has touched them, and to say, your family is my family. And kind of some people say, you know what? I've got a lot of cancers in my family, and I don't know what the pattern is, but I'm going to get a genetics test, and I never have thought about that. So kind of to the extent that I think it's kind of a call to action on that makes me feel good.
Yeah, and it may be a very small number of families who are afflicted with this or who have this, but the book is obviously a broader study. I mean, it's a study of this in a particular way. But it's a story of cancer research.
Yes, right.
And all of the fits and starts and progress and setbacks and why it takes so long. I mean,
the progress and the
progress in which there has been, as you note, quite a lot, but much more to be done.
Much more to come.
Hi, my name is Contessa Bourbon. I'd like to ask Larry, amid family cancer tragedies, what was the most rewarding moment for you while writing this book?
Again, I think it was this, kind of for me, it was this journey of discovery and reconnecting with, kind of my extended family members, kind of not just my relatives who knew most of this history, but with my friends of my sisters who I haven't been out of touch with long ago. I think I write in the last chapter, we live on in memories, but we don't live on kind of forever in memories. Kind of we're gone. We're here and then we're gone. Our lives are really kind of relatively brief. And for me, this was an opportunity to, I think, kind of let my children know more detail about what happened to my family, but my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren, who I may never know, that will do this record of kind of what, kind of not just my family, but other families have gone through.
I had the privilege of working for you, Larry, and one of the things that people who work with Larry get to learn very quickly is how close you were to your brother and how much you admired him. And one of the things that I remember you talking about is because you lost so many other members of your family, how the two of you were kind of going through the world together. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with Paul and just about Paul and his life and his career?
Yeah. So we were 2 years apart. So obviously there were times we were very close, but also times that we were quite competitive too. I tell the story. I don't think I put it in the book. Kind of one time we were kind of playing, kind of sandlot baseball, and there was some argument or other, and kind of over whose turn it was to bat. And so I stood on the plate and wouldn't move, and so he got the bat and kind of whacked me in the head. But I say, I also say that, kind of psychologists would have a lot of fun with us. So, kind of Paul went to University of Illinois, kind of started working at the Daily Illini, kind of newspaper where a lot of us did, kind of. I went to the University of Illinois not knowing exactly what I was going to do, but lo and behold, guess what I did? I went to work for the Daily Limelight. He got out of school, kind of his second job was the Wall Street Journal. Kind of I got out of school and kind of my second job was the Wall Street Journal, right? Kind of so there is a pattern there. I think kind of even if I might not say kind of the way that you said I looked up to him, I'm sure that I did. And I, kind of look. I think that you kind of as siblings, you always kind of have a tight bond with your siblings. But for me, kind of and Paul, with all the deaths in the family, I think kind of at some point we were what's left. Our wives are best friends, and that's kind of a real kind of special thing. Kind of unfortunately, my wife Vicky isn't here today, and kind of my son was born, kind of a month ahead of two of Paul's sons, twin sons, including Charlie, who died of cancer. And kind of we bonded. Kind of one of the hard things at times was Charlie having cancer and my son playing with his son and seeing, kind of my son being healthy and, kind of his son. But through all that, we were kind of huge cheerleaders for each other. So I remember in 1993, Paul won a Pulitzer Prize for beat reporting, coverage of General Motors in Detroit. We were both at the Wall Street Journal at the time. And I remember one of my colleagues said to me at the time, "Well, aren't you jealous?" And I was like, "It's my brother." No, I'm not jealous. I'm kind of like thrilled about it. Kind of, I was excited for him. I thought that was just kind of maybe people don't understand, kind of, and maybe kind of some brothers would be jealous, but I think because we were so close, it just wasn't something I would ever be jealous about. And the other thing I kind of say, kind of look at all Paul went through 4 or 5 cancers before the one that finally killed him. He tests positive in 2015 for the mutation. I don't get tested right away because I think, why should I get tested? I haven't had any of these cancers. And my daughter kind of was like, kept after me to get tested. And so I finally decided to get tested. Paul, kind of found back then tests were pretty expensive. They were $5,000. Mine probably wouldn't be insurance because I didn't have any cancers. So basically he found a study in USC that was kind of for Li-Fraumeni families. And so I got a free test. And I remember kind of, I kind of got the test result about a month after I took the test. And I sent him an email and I said, I think with the results, and said, kind of, look, I'm negative. And his response was nothing more. It was just great news, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. And, I think that says a lot about our relationship. It was not like, kind of why me, why not you? And I found in my reporting that that happens in families, and that's natural. I mean, kind of who, kind of when you see that, one side has no, kind of one branch has no cancers, and the other is like riddled with cancers, and, children, kind of young adults and dying and terrible stuff happening. It's easy to say, kind of why me, not a hint of that. So, kind of I think that really kind of sums up. Good to see you, David.
That reminds me. Just we were talking earlier. I watched Paul go through this from a distance. I didn't see him a lot, but I was in touch with him, and it took reading this book to remind me of exactly how much he had gone through over so many years. But as you said when we were talking, you were carrying on your lives.
Yeah. Right.
It wasn't as though the cancer was everything. Right. And knowing what Paul was doing, from what I could see, and now understanding all of it, what he was going through, and the interactions between the two of you through those periods. I mean, that bond was so strong.
And a lot of people here know my brother, but not everybody knows my brother. My brother was a really, kind of terrific journalist, kind of very accomplished. He wrote 3 books. He was like one of the leading kind of auto writers of the past half century. But, kind of had very major jobs at the Wall Street Journal and Reuters. So, kind of never, kind of the cancers were not easy, but, kind of it didn't define his life. And that's one of the things that, kind of I think is is so neat about him. You know, kind of he loved what he did, working. He was a big fly fisherman. He loved to golf. You know, kind of he in you know kind of those years he packed it all in, and for all the tragedy in our lives, I think that you know kind of I'd say that Paul and I both felt blessed in many ways. I mean, of course there was the sadness in our sisters and everything, but we also kind of recognize that many families have tragedies to deal with, and this was just you know kind of something. It was part of our lives. It was not our life.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I also worked for Larry at the Journal and with Larry. I have a question about the search that you undertook and what, if any, expectations you had when you began investigating your family history. Because you mentioned that you don't believe there were cancers prior to your mom.
Right.
Were you able to go back generations? And, you know, I have this sort of cinematic image of you sort of ticking off the names of
you know,
relatives.
Now that you asked this, I should have done that because I could have had a trip to Italy that I could have written because I could have written off as an expense. You know, kind of. So kind of now, if I go to Italy, kind of I'm going to have to pay for it without kind of taking it as expense in my. I didn't go back that far, and I think partly because nobody ever had talked about that. You know, kind of, and you know. Now it would have been, and I think it would have been really hard to kind of look for going back that far.
Would it have mattered? I mean, or is there a belief scientifically that it might have just originated with your mom and that's it?
And first of all, it probably wouldn't have mattered. It was what it is, but you know, kind of, and you know, kind of given that my mother had just one sister, neither of her kids had cancer, and they're kind of about my age. Okay, so it's just a little bit, you know, kind of like me. My father's side, there have been cancers, but nothing unusual cancers, like the rates of cancers, like normal cancer rates in families. You know, it was really kind of, first of all, I wanted to understand the mutation and kind of what it was. Why was this so bad? Why was it causing? And then that led me to, you know, kind of think, well, what might be done about it? And the last third of the book a lot is looking at ongoing efforts to try to do whatever you can to do about it. And I thought that would be enlightening. And also, I mean, I think at some point, fairly early on, I recognized that this research was really quite heroic. and you know, Fred, Li, and Joe Fraumeni are very well known in cancer circles, right? But I think that they probably haven't had as much recognition outside cancer circles as you know, kind of they are due. I mean, there are many brilliant scientists who you know, kind of don't win Nobel Prizes, who really kind of do a lot to advance. And they were dedicated, and also they did it because in the end they really cared about the patients. And so I think, you know, you don't have one motivation when you write something. I think it started with just I want a little bit of understanding, but then it kind of grew into these guys. This was really heroic, and it was kind of amazing because they kind of had so much resistance early on. You know, kind of. So that's another kind of thing that I wanted to show, just kind of how, you know, kind of science worked. But then it also grew into maybe I can, you know, kind of raise a little bit of awareness about this community, which it's a painful community. I write a little bit in the book. Kind of there are various like there's a lot of bad things about Facebook, but there's a great place for connection and everything. And there are Facebook groups that are devoted, you know, kind of support groups for families with Li-Fraumeni syndrome. And you know, people go and share their stories, and it's kind of heartbreaking. And they need something to kind of grasp, and they know that there aren't any answers, but they want to be able to connect to other people. So I think over time it evolved into, you know, trying to serve several purposes, not just one purpose.
Thanks, Larry. Good to see you.
Larry, it's a great book. I mean, it's a powerful book. It is a mystery story, such a personal story. So congratulations. Thank you for sharing this today.
Thank you, my friend. And just, I don't recognize everybody. I just want to thank my friends coming here. They're kind of a lot of friends, and I know there's some people from the NCI and you know, kind of again, Li, Fraumeni. These people were kind of really kind of essential in kind of helping make this happen. So thanks very much.